The morning Hugh Bailey finally laughed again. The sound startled a crow clean off the fence post outside the bunkhouse window, and every man at the breakfast table went so still you could hear the grease cooling in the iron skillet. But that comes later. To understand why that laugh mattered so much, you have to go back to the autumn of 1882 and the night the North herd disappeared. Hugh Bailey was 31 years old when the worst thing that could happen to a cattle rancher in the New Mexico territory happened to him in the span of a single black night. He ran the Crooked Spur Ranch outside the small town of Canyon Rojo, a wide stretch of sun-hardened land where the red mesas cut the sky into pieces and the grass came in sparse but sweet. His father had built the ranch from nothing, and Hugh had inherited both the land and the particular stubborn pride that kept men like him from ever walking away from difficult things. The North herd was 460 head of the finest longhorn cattle in the territory, and Hugh had spent 3 years building that herd up from a modest 200 animals his father had left him. He had worked through droughts and bad winters, and one summer where the water table dropped so low he had to haul barrels of water from the creek 2 miles east. He had done all of that with his jaw set and his eyes forward. The North herd was the proof of that work. It was the result of every early morning and every aching night, every dollar pinched and every luxury skipped. On the 14th of October, 1882, a group of cattle thieves working in the employ of a competing outfit out of Santa Fe pushed the entire North herd through a gap in the fence line while Hugh's night rider, a young man named Cord Pruitt, lay unconscious in the grass with a knot on his head the size of a hen's egg. By the time first light came and Cord came crawling back to the main house with blood in his eyes and apology on his tongue, the herd was gone. 460 animals, 3 years of grinding labor, and somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 in future value, all of it swallowed by the dark. Hugh had ridden after them, naturally. He had taken his 2 best hands, a wiry man named Pete Hollies and a steady-handed Texan called Frank Garza, and they had ridden north through 2 full days of hard country. They found scattered signs, found 3 dead steers that had gone lame and been abandoned, found the cold remains of a fire. But the thieves knew the land and they had enough of a head start, and by the time Hugh came to the edge of a canyon looking down at an empty stretch of nothing, he understood what it meant. The herd was gone, gone for real and gone for good. He rode back to the Crooked Spur in silence. Pete tried to say something consoling, and Hugh stopped him with a look that the man never forgot. Frank Garza, who had seen plenty of hard things in his life, later told the other hands that it was the quietest ride he had ever endured, and he had once escorted a dead man's body 200 miles back to his family. After that, Hugh Bailey changed. He was not cruel, and he was not a drunk, and he did not take his grief out on the men who worked for him. He was simply quiet in a way that went beyond ordinary reserve. He worked harder than ever, rebuilt the herd over the next 2 years with smaller stock bought cheap and raised patient, and the Crooked Spur survived. But there was something that had gone out of him, something that the men around him could feel even when they could not name it. He had been, by all accounts, a man who used to laugh easily, a man who could find the funny side of a miserable situation, who could make a joke in the middle of a cattle drive that would have the whole crew going for an hour. That man had ridden north after the stolen herd and had not come back. The man who returned was capable and competent and fair, but he kept himself behind a certain wall, and no one had ever seen him lower it. By the spring of 1884, the Crooked Spur was doing well enough again. Hugh had 11 hands on the payroll, and he was cautious about expanding too fast, but the herd was solid and the land was good, and there was reason to feel something like steadiness about the future. What the Crooked Spur did not have was a cook. Their previous cook, a Mexican man named Ernesto who had been feeding the bunkhouse for 6 years, had gotten a letter in February from his brother down in Chihuahua, and the news in that letter had sent him riding south with his hat in his hand and his eyes red. Hugh had wished him well and meant it. But that left 11 hungry men, and Hugh himself with no one who knew how to do more than boil water and burn beans. And after 2 months of rotating the cooking duty among the hands in a way that produced results ranging from barely acceptable to genuinely alarming, Hugh had done what men in his position did in 1884. He had placed an advertisement. He was not placing an advertisement for a wife. He was very clear about that in his own mind, and he was very clear about it in the wording of the advertisement as well. He needed a cook, a capable woman who could manage a bunkhouse kitchen and feed a crew of working men 3 times a day, 7 days a week. He offered a fair wage and a private room attached to the main house kitchen, which was more than most outfits offered. He sent the advertisement to the Canyon Rojo Gazette and also to a paper in Santa Fe, and he waited. He received 4 responses. 2 of them were from women whose handwriting and stated experience made him reasonably confident they could not have boiled water without burning it. One was from a widow in Albuquerque who was very forthcoming in expressing that she was looking for a husband and viewed the position primarily as a means of audition, which Hugh respected for its honesty but could not act on. The 4th letter was from a woman named Mamie Whitfield, and it arrived in a plain envelope addressed in handwriting that was clean and direct, the letters made with a confidence that did not waste space. Her letter was not long, but every sentence in it was worth reading. She wrote that she was 27 years old and had spent 4 years cooking for a logging camp in Colorado before the camp closed when the timber ran out. Before that, she had kept house and fed the hired hands for her father's farm in Kansas from the time she was 15 until his death 2 years prior. She understood outdoor men and what they required at a table after a hard day's work. She was not afraid of early hours or large quantities or difficult weather. She enclosed one reference from the logging camp foreman, a man named McAllister, who wrote in a separate note that Mamie Whitfield was the best cook he had ever encountered in 30 years of feeding working men, that she was reliable and sensible, and had once kept the camp fed for 3 days during a blizzard that blocked all supply routes through nothing but resourcefulness and a very good knowledge of what could be done with dried beans, smoked pork, and cornmeal. Hugh read the letter twice. Then he read the reference twice. Then he wrote back and offered her the position and told her when to come. She arrived on a Wednesday in the last week of April 1884, coming off the stage from Santa Fe with 2 large trunks and a canvas bag over her shoulder and a look about her that Hugh noticed immediately. It was not a pretty woman look, though she was pretty, with dark hair and steady gray eyes and a face that had seen some sun without apology. It was more that she carried herself like someone who had decided a long time ago that the world was going to be a certain kind of difficult, and had made her peace with that, and was now fully occupied with the business of living in spite of it. Hugh met the stage himself because the arrangement called for it, and because he was a man who met his obligations personally. He introduced himself, shook her hand, and told her he would have Pete load her trunks. She said thank you and looked around at the town of Canyon Rojo with the expression of someone doing a quiet inventory, and then she asked if the kitchen at the ranch had a wood-burning range or a fireplace. He said it had a wood-burning range, a good one, a 4-burner Majestic that had come in by wagon from Santa Fe 2 years ago. She nodded and said that would do well enough, and they walked to the wagon. He showed her the kitchen on arrival and the private room, and she took both in with the same quiet inventory look and asked where the nearest well was and how deep it ran. He told her. She asked what the men typically ate at breakfast. He told her that too, which was to say eggs and salt pork and bread and coffee, nothing remarkable, because remarkable had not been possible since Ernesto left. She looked at the provisions in the dry larder and the cool room, and made a sound that was not quite disapproval but lived in the same neighborhood, and she said she would need to go over the stores with him and revise the supply order. He said that was fine. She made dinner that first night, and it was pot roast with gravy and boiled potatoes, and a pan of corn bread that came out of the oven golden and steaming. And the bunkhouse went silent for about 30 seconds when the food hit the table. And then there was nothing but the sound of men eating with real feeling. Frank Garza, who was not a sentimental man, later said it was the best meal he had eaten since his mother died, and he said it directly to Mamie's face, and she thanked him without any fuss and told him to pass the bread. Hugh did not eat dinner with the hands. He ate at the house. She brought his plate to the dining room and set it on the table and went back to the kitchen, and he ate alone the way he had been eating alone for some time. The food was remarkable. He ate every bite and sat for a moment afterward with a feeling he could not immediately name, and then recognized as something close to gratitude, which was not a feeling he had allowed himself in a while. The days that followed established a rhythm. Mamie rose before anyone else, which was before dawn, and had coffee ready when the hands came in from the bunkhouse at 5 in the morning. She fed them breakfast, sent them out, and spent the day managing the kitchen and the stores and the planning of meals with an efficiency that was almost military. She also, Hugh noticed, kept herself from getting tangled up in the social life of the bunkhouse in the way that occasionally made trouble on outfits where the hired cook was a woman. She was friendly and fair, and she remembered what every man liked and disliked, and she fed them accordingly, but she kept a certain professional distance that the men recognized and respected without really thinking about it. She and Hugh crossed paths mostly in the kitchen. He came through for his coffee in the morning and sometimes stopped to discuss supply needs or to tell her when extra men would be coming in from the range and would need feeding. Their conversations were practical and brief. He found himself, after a week, looking forward to them in a way he chose not to examine. She had opinions, which he discovered gradually. She had opinions about the quality of the flour she had been buying from the general store in town, and she expressed them plainly, not in a complaining way, but in a direct woman managing a household way that reminded him, suddenly and unexpectedly, of his mother. She had opinions about how the firewood was being stacked next to the kitchen door, which was in a way that made it difficult to get to quickly on cold mornings, and she mentioned this to Pete, who stacked it better the next day without any argument because Pete had been eating Mamie's biscuits for a week and was fully converted. She had opinions about whether the cool room was being kept at the right temperature for the meat, and when she expressed this to Hugh directly, he looked at how the cool room was being managed and conceded she was right and made the adjustment. She did not volunteer personal information, and he did not ask for it. This suited them both, or at least it suited Hugh, and it seemed to suit Mamie well enough. And so the weeks passed in that comfortable professional distance that was nevertheless beginning, in ways neither of them was fully acknowledging, to feel like a great deal more than professionalism. It was in the third week of May that things shifted slightly, and it was because of a storm. The storm came up fast in the late afternoon, the kind of green sky spring storm that the territory threw at you without much warning, and it brought hail with it, genuine hail the size of marbles that came rattling down on the roof in the yard and sent the horses into a panic. Hugh was in the barn working with Frank to get the animals settled when a piece of hail came through the gap in the barn door and hit him across the knuckles of his left hand and split the skin. It was not serious, just a cut, but it bled freely, and by the time the storm passed, and Hugh came out of the barn, his hand was wrapped in a cloth that was more red than white. He came into the kitchen to find something clean to bind it with, and Mamie was there, finishing the bread she had been baking before the storm hit. She saw the hand immediately, and without asking any questions, she steered him to the chair near the window, took the bloody cloth off, examined the cut with the same inventory expression she applied to most things, and went for the clean linen and the carbolic she kept in the kitchen medical tin. He sat there while she cleaned and bound the cut, which she did with quick and competent hands and no unnecessary gentleness, and also no unnecessary roughness, just the right amount of each. And he was struck again by the quality of simple competence in a person who really had it. The storm was still moving off outside, the thunder rolling east and the hail turning back to rain, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of bread, and the light was the particular golden gray that follows a storm. She tied off the bandage and said that it would be fine as long as he kept it clean and did not go sticking it in anything that would get dirt in it. He said he would try to avoid that. She looked up at him then because she had been looking at the bandage, and there was a fraction of a second where neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which was the thing he noticed, the thing he turned over in his mind later that night. It was simply a moment between two people who were, it turned out, not as separate from each other as the professional distance they kept might suggest. She was the one who broke it, in the only way it could be properly broken, which was by going back to work. She stood up and checked the bread and said it needed another 10 minutes and asked if he wanted coffee while he was there. He said he did. She brought it and he drank it, and they talked, for the first time, about something that was not directly related to the business of the ranch kitchen. She asked him, in a practical way that was nevertheless curious, how long he had run the Crooked Spur. He told her. He told her about his father briefly. She asked if it had always just been him running it, and he said yes, since his father died 7 years back. And before he could stop himself, he said something he had not said to anyone in a long time, which was that there had been a woman once, years ago, before the trouble with the herd, but that it had not worked out and he had not pursued the matter further. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she understood the feeling of having set something down and not quite finding the occasion to pick it back up. He looked at her over his coffee cup and asked what it was she had set down. She said she had been engaged to a man in Colorado, a man at the logging camp where she had cooked, a good man in most ways, but they had wanted different things from life in ways that only became clear when they got close enough to the question to see it plainly. She said she had walked away from it herself, and that she did not regret it, but that it had taken a certain settled time to get clear on what she actually wanted from the shape of her life. He asked what she had concluded. She said she had concluded she wanted to work, and to be useful, and to be somewhere that felt like it was worth the staying. He said that seemed like a reasonable set of conclusions. She said she thought so. The bread was done. She took it out of the oven, and the conversation ended in the way that conversations end when the ordinary business of life reasserts itself, which was naturally and without any awkwardness, and Hugh went back to the house with his bound hand and his coffee, and sat for a while in the quiet thinking about things he had not thought about in a long time. June came in hot and dry, and with it came a problem. The problem was that a neighboring rancher, a man named Dexter Coles, who ran the Big C outfit 10 miles to the west, had been quietly and persistently buying up the small water rights along the creek that fed the Crooked Spur's south pasture. Coles was the kind of man who believed that enough money applied in the right places made law optional, and he had the money and the connections in Santa Fe that made this belief partially functional in practice. Hugh had known about Coles's maneuvering for some months, and had taken legal steps to protect his own water rights through the county recorder's office. But the situation had a weight to it that pressed on him in the evenings when he sat on the porch and looked at the land. He mentioned this to no one in detail, but Mamie was perceptive, and one evening when she brought his dinner to the house, he was sitting at his desk with the land survey papers spread out in front of him, and the look on his face that his hands had long since learned to read as serious trouble. She set his dinner down and looked at the papers for a moment without prying, and then said that she was going to town the next morning for supplies and asked if there was anything specific he needed her to look into while she was there. He said there was, actually. He asked her to stop at the lawyer's office and pick up a copy of the filing his lawyer had made with the county, which he had been meaning to collect for 2 weeks, but had not had the occasion. She said she would do that. She came back the next afternoon with the supplies and the papers, and also with information, because Mamie Whitfield had the useful quality of being the kind of woman that people talked to without realizing they were giving away things. In the course of doing her shopping, she had spoken to the woman at the dry goods store, who had spoken to the wife of the county recorder, who had mentioned in a general social way that Dexter Coles had sent a man to the recorder's office twice in the past month asking about the filing procedures for water rights challenges. The news was not surprising, but it was specific, and it meant Hugh had less time than he had thought. He had to get to his lawyer immediately, which he did the following morning. The legal process that followed over the next several weeks was grinding and expensive, and produced no violence but a great deal of paperwork and several very unpleasant letters from Coles's lawyer in Santa Fe. And at the end of it, the county board reviewed the rights and affirmed Hugh's claim to the water. Coles did not take the loss cheerfully, but he took it, because there was nothing else he could legally do, and the summer went on. Through all of this, the rhythm of the Crooked Spur continued, and the rhythm of Hugh and Mamie's daily proximity continued inside it. Mornings with coffee and the day's practicalities. Occasional moments that lingered longer than practical necessity required. The gradual, almost imperceptible lowering of something that Hugh had built up carefully over 2 years of quiet grief. The hands noticed, of course. Men who work together in close quarters notice everything, and they discussed it in the particular oblique way that working men discuss things they find interesting but do not want to make too large. Frank Garza and Pete Hollies had a running quiet wager that neither of them ever formalized, which was essentially about when Hugh was going to do something about the way he looked at Mamie when she was not looking back. Young Cord Pruitt, who was 21 now and had never entirely forgiven himself for the night the herd was stolen, watched Hugh with a kind of hopeful attention, because Cord had worked for Hugh long enough to remember the man who used to laugh, and he wanted that man back. There was a Saturday in July when a minor thing happened that was more significant than it looked. It was a Sunday, actually, a day when the hands had their afternoon hours to themselves, and most of them were in the bunkhouse playing cards or mending gear, and Hugh had come into the kitchen for something and found Mamie at the table with a letter in her hands that she folded quickly when she heard him come in, not in a guilty way but in the way of someone putting away something private. He apologized for interrupting, and she said he was not interrupting and set the letter down on the corner of the table. He could see it was written in a woman's hand, not a man's, and he did not ask about it. He got what he had come for and turned to go, and she said, in the particular tone of someone deciding to say something they had been half deciding for a while, that the letter was from her sister in Kansas. He stopped and turned back. She said her sister was asking her to come back to Kansas. Not permanently, just a visit. Her sister had a new baby, the first one, and she was having a hard time and wanting family near. He said that was understandable and asked if she was thinking of going. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasion but genuine thought, and then she said that she was not sure. She said she had been thinking about what it meant to have chosen to come here, to this particular place, and whether that choice had been the right one. He said, because something in the moment required honesty and he had been practicing the avoidance of it for too long, that he hoped she felt the choice had been the right one. She looked at him in a way that was different from the inventory look, a way that was direct in a personal rather than practical sense, and she said she thought it had been. He nodded and left the kitchen, and stood in the hallway for a moment collecting himself, in a way he had not needed to do in a very long time. She wrote to her sister that she could not come just now but would send some money and would come in the autumn if she possibly could, and she told Hugh none of this because there was no reason she should have to, and he did not know about the decision until much later, when she told him herself, and by then everything was different. The summer moved forward, hot and demanding in the way that summers in the New Mexico territory always were, and the Crooked Spur moved with it, the work of ranching filling every day with its specific and unending requirements. The herd needed managing, the land needed tending, the business end of things needed Hugh's attention in ways that did not stop when the sun went down. Through all of it, the kitchen was a constant. 3 times a day the men came in and Mamie fed them, and the food was always good and sometimes was extraordinary, and the crew of the Crooked Spur was, without any of them saying it directly, a happier outfit than it had been in quite some time. What happened at the end of August was partly Frank Garza's fault, and partly just the shape that things take when they have been building towards something for a while. Frank had a bottle of whiskey that a trader had sold him in town, and on the last Saturday of August he shared it with Pete and Cord and 2 other hands named Samuel Weeks and Dahlen Reese, and the sharing went on for longer than was strictly wise, and by late evening there was singing in the bunkhouse, the kind of singing that is more enthusiastic than accomplished. Hugh could hear it from the house, and he chose to ignore it because the men had earned their Saturday evening, and no one was causing trouble. They were just loud. Mamie, whose room was closer to the bunkhouse, came to the kitchen door and knocked, and when Hugh came she reported that the singing had moved on to requests for more singing, specifically requests aimed at her to come and play the harmonica she kept in her room, and that several of the hands had apparently heard her playing to herself on quiet evenings. He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a particular shared quality to the look, amusement held in check by mutual professional dignity, and he asked if she played the harmonica. She said she played it well enough to keep the notes mostly in line. He said he had never heard her play. She said she generally played when people were not within hearing distance, but that apparently the acoustics of the summer evening had been working against her. He said, and he was not sure exactly what moved him to say it, that he would walk over with her if she was going. For propriety's sake was the reason he gave himself. She said she supposed that would be all right. They walked over to the bunkhouse together in the evening air, which was warm and smelled of dust and dry grass, and the particular clean darkness that the desert makes at night, and the hands received them both with the particular boisterous welcome of men who have had enough whiskey to be delighted by company. Mamie sat on an upturned crate and played her harmonica, and she had been telling the truth when she said she played it well enough to keep the notes in line, because she was actually quite good, and she played a series of tunes that the men sang along to badly and joyfully, and Hugh sat on the bench near the door and watched. And for the first time in a very long time, the wall he had built felt not like a protection, but like a place that was simply farther from where he wanted to be. Cord Pruitt, emboldened by the whiskey and the harmonica and the general good feeling of the evening, called across the bunkhouse to Hugh and said that it was good to hear music in the place again, and that it was good to see him there. And he said it with the earnest, emotional directness of a young man who has had 2 glasses of whiskey and genuinely means what he is saying. The other hands went quiet for just a second, because Cord had said something that touched a truth they all lived around but did not address. And then Frank Garza said, "Hear, hear," in a rumbling voice, and Pete Hollies tipped his cup, and that was that. Hugh caught Mamie's eye across the bunkhouse, and she gave him a look that was quiet and kind and did not require any words, and he thought that he had not had a look like that aimed at him in years, and it landed somewhere deep and stayed there. September brought cooler nights and the beginning of the fall work, and it also brought an unexpected visitor. The visitor was a man named Cole Whitfield, Mamie's younger brother, who arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, having tracked his sister down through a combination of her last letter home and a good deal of asking around. He was 23 years old and lean, and had Mamie's gray eyes and a face that was younger and more uncertain than hers, and he had ridden 3 days from Amarillo, where he had been working for a cattle outfit that had just let half its crew go when the owner decided to reduce the herd. He was not in trouble, exactly. He was not the kind of trouble that a brother arriving at an employer's ranch could sometimes be. He was simply a young man who was between situations and had a sister he trusted and no very clear picture of what came next. Hugh met him in the yard and looked at him for a moment and then asked if he could work cattle. Cole said he could, sir. He could work cattle just fine. Hugh said he would put him on for the fall roundup, after which they would assess from there, and that he should get his gear settled and report to Frank Garza, who was the foreman. Cole Whitfield looked at his sister, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with an apron and an expression that was partly exasperated and partly genuinely pleased, and then he looked back at Hugh and said thank you in a way that was sincere. Mamie came out into the yard and took her brother by the arm and walked him to the bunkhouse, and Hugh watched them go and thought that the Crooked Spur had acquired a great deal of humanity in the past few months, and that it felt, against all his careful armor, like the right direction. Cole proved himself useful quickly, which relieved Hugh and pleased Frank and settled the matter of his continued employment without requiring further discussion. He was good with the horses and better with the cattle, and he had a practical good humor that the other hands liked, and that made him easy to have around. He also, being Mamie's brother and living in close proximity to her, provided Hugh with a somewhat different kind of access to her than he had had previously, which was the access of someone who knew the other person in a dimensional way and was available to talk about them. Cole was not a gossip, and he was not trying to broker anything. But he was a young man who loved his sister and who had eyes, and about 2 weeks into his time at the Crooked Spur, he came and found Hugh working alone at the corral fence on a Sunday afternoon, and offered his help with the fencing, and after they had worked in silence for a while said, in the offhand way of someone making conversation, that he had not seen Mamie look settled in a long time, not since before their father died, and that it was good to see it. Hugh said that he was glad she was comfortable at the Crooked Spur. Cole said that he thought it was more than comfort, sir, if he was going to be honest. Hugh looked at him. Cole did not look away. He had the same quality his sister had of not being afraid of a direct look. Hugh said nothing for a moment, and then said that Cole was a good hand, and that he hoped he would stay on past the roundup. Cole said he hoped so too and went back to the fencing, and neither of them said anything further on the subject. But the conversation had happened, and it settled into the air of the afternoon like a flag planted on a hill. October came, and with it the anniversary of the night the North herd was stolen. Hugh did not mark the date publicly. He never had. But the hands who had been at the Crooked Spur in those years knew what the 14th of October was, and they knew what it did to Hugh, which was not a dramatic thing, but a quiet settling of the particular grayness that lived in him more deeply than usual. He worked through the day without comment, and came in to dinner without comment, and the men who knew gave him the space to be quiet, and the men who did not followed the lead of those who did. Mamie did not know what date it was in that particular way. But she noticed that he was quieter at breakfast on that morning, noticed it in the specific way she noticed all things about him, which was fully and without making it obvious. She did not ask. She made the best breakfast she could, and when he came through the kitchen for his coffee she handed it to him and said, quite simply and without preamble, that whatever a man was carrying he could set it down at her table if he chose, and that the coffee was hot. He looked at her for a long moment. He said thank you. She said he was welcome and went back to the stove. He took his coffee to the porch and sat with it and the morning and the long specific grief that the date carried, and somewhere in the middle of it the grief shifted slightly, the way a heavy thing can shift when there is someone else in the general vicinity of it, not carrying it for you but simply present, and the shift made the day survivable in a way that the previous 2 Octobers had not entirely been. He told her that night. Not everything, not the full weight of the 2 years, but enough. He came to the kitchen after dinner, which he did sometimes, and she poured him coffee as she always did, and he sat at the table and told her about the night of the 14th of October, 1882, and the 460 head, and the 2 days of riding north and the cold fire and the empty canyon and the ride home in silence. She listened without interrupting, which was itself a gift. When he finished, she sat for a moment, and then she said that she thought losing something you had built with your own hands was one of the deepest losses there was, because it was not just the thing itself, but the proof of everything you had put into it, and that grief of that kind did not have a simple shape or a simple end. He said that was as accurate a description as he had encountered. She said that she had noticed he was a man who did not laugh easily, not anymore, and that she had heard from Frank, in the way these things got mentioned, that he had been different before. He said that was true enough. She said she thought a man could come back to himself, if he gave himself the occasion to. He said he was beginning to think so. They stayed at the table for another hour, talking, really talking in the way that people do when the door between them has finally been opened far enough to walk through. And by the time Mamie said she needed to get to bed because 4:30 came fast, something fundamental had changed between them. It was not yet said in words, but it was as real as the land outside and the stars above it and the coffee cooling in the cups on the table. November moved through the Crooked Spur with its cold winds and clear skies, and Hugh and Mamie moved through it together, though still with a proper distance maintained, still with the shape of employer and employee in the daylight hours, though the evenings in the kitchen had become a regular thing that both of them looked forward to and neither of them discussed as such. Cole watched with quiet satisfaction. Frank Garza quietly won his unformalized wager with Pete Holly's, which Pete paid in the form of doing Frank's fence mending for a week without complaint. It was in the first week of December that Hugh Bailey finally, decisively, and without further equivocation, did something about what he had been feeling since at least May. He asked Mamie if she would walk with him on Sunday afternoon, not about ranch business, just to walk. She looked at him with the gray eyes that saw everything and said she would like that. They walked out through the south pasture in the cold December light, wrapped in their coats, the dry grass silver brown and the sky the particular deep blue of a winter New Mexico afternoon. The herd moved in the distance, a slow, steady, dark mass against the land. There was no wind for once, and the quiet was the kind that the desert makes in winter, which is immense and clean. He said to her, stopping near the creek, that he had been trying for several months to find the right moment for what he wanted to say, and had come to the conclusion that there was not going to be a perfect moment, and that waiting for one was a way of not saying the thing. She turned to face him, steady. He said that he had not looked forward to anything the way he looked forward to talking with her in a very long time. He said that she had brought something to the Crooked Spur that was more than cooking, though the cooking was extraordinary and he meant that, and that she had brought it without trying, just by being the particular person she was. He said he was aware that she worked for him, and that he did not intend the difference in their positions to press her toward anything she did not freely choose, and he said it with enough seriousness that she could see he meant it precisely. He said that he thought he was in love with her, and that he was telling her because he was 33 years old and had spent too long being quiet about things that needed to be spoken. She looked at him for a moment with the wind going still around them and the creek moving quiet behind her, and she said that she had come to the Crooked Spur not looking for love and had found it anyway, which she understood to be the way love generally arrived, without asking permission. He reached out and took her hand, the one not holding her coat closed, and she let him. She said that she was in love with him too, and that she had been since approximately the evening in the bunkhouse when she looked up from the harmonica and found him watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before and which she had thought about frequently since. He said he was glad to hear it. She said she supposed he was. They stood there in the cold light by the creek for a while with the sound of the water and the distant cattle and the enormous western sky above them, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, which was the first time, and it was not a tentative thing. It was the kind of kiss that knows what it is about. She kissed him back. They walked home to the ranch in the late afternoon light with their hands still joined, and Frank Garza, who happened to be passing the fence line with a load of posts, saw them coming and had the good sense not to say a single word, though his expression was the one men make when something they have been expecting for a long time has finally arrived, and the relief is enormous. That evening at dinner, the bunkhouse crew had the particular heightened awareness of men who can feel that something has shifted in the atmosphere around them. Nobody said anything during dinner, though the silence had a different quality than the usual silence of men eating, being more alive with unasked questions. Mamie served and moved through the room with her usual efficiency and her usual distance, but there was a warmth in her that was slightly different, a particular settled quality, and the men who noticed it mostly exchanged looks across the table and got back to their food. Hugh ate at the house as always, and afterward he came to the kitchen door and knocked, which was itself a change from his habit of simply coming in, and Mamie came to the door and he asked if she might have a moment, and she stepped out onto the back porch with him in the cold night air, and they talked for a while in low voices, not about anything dramatic, just about the days coming and the stock and the winter preparations, which were the ordinary subjects, but now carrying a warmth between them that made the ordinary feel remarkable. The weeks that followed were, in the way of genuine things beginning, both wonderful and also the strange work of two careful people learning to be less careful with each other. They were both people who had learned to hold things back, Mamie from the long years of being the capable one in every room, the one who kept things running, who did not require looking after, and Hugh from the grief and the theft and the quiet years behind his wall. Learning to be in love, which is what they were doing, required them to practice something they had both gotten out of the habit of, which was trusting. They practiced it in the evenings in the kitchen and on Sunday walks, and in the small daily moments that accumulated into a life. Mamie took to leaving a fresh coffee cup on Hugh's side of the kitchen table in the mornings, which was a small thing, but was the kind of small thing that means everything. Hugh took to asking her opinion on decisions about the ranch, not because he needed a business partner, but because he wanted to share the weight, and she gave her opinion in the direct, uncomplicated way that was one of the things he loved about her. Christmas came in 1884 with cold nights and a sky thick with stars, and Hugh bought Mamie a small silver brooch from the jeweler in town that came in a box wrapped in paper, which she unwrapped on Christmas morning at the kitchen table with Cole and several of the hands present, because Mamie had made it a Crooked Spur tradition in her months there to have a proper Christmas breakfast for everyone. And the Christmas breakfast included hot cakes and sausage and eggs, and a spice cake she had been building toward for 2 weeks. She opened the box and held the brooch in her palm for a moment, and then looked up at Hugh with eyes that were not quite crying but were in the general neighborhood, and she said it was beautiful. He said it reminded him of her, which produced a silence around the table that was the silence of 11 men collectively trying to pretend they were not witnessing something intimate. Cole Whitfield cleared his throat and asked about the hot cakes, and the moment passed into the general warmth of the morning, but Mamie pinned the brooch to her dress before the day was done and wore it from then on. January 1885 brought a cold that was deep and serious, and the Crooked Spur came through it the way ranches came through hard winters, by working constantly and not complaining and trusting the preparations that had been made in the fall. The water barrels froze twice, and the hands spent 2 days breaking ice at the troughs, and Mamie kept the kitchen burning 20 hours a day, and made sure there was always hot food available because cold working men needed more than 3 meals when the temperature dropped that far. During a cold snap in the second week of January, with the wind coming hard from the north, Hugh came in from the cattle check at midnight, having been out since before dark, and he was cold in a way that was past simple discomfort, his hands clumsy and his face blank with it. And Mamie heard him come in and came to the kitchen and took one look at him and put him in the chair near the stove and took his boots off herself and held his hands between hers to warm them and told him in a level voice that he was a fool for staying out that long. He said he had needed to check on the north pasture animals. She said the animals could have waited until first light. He said they could not. She said he was going to agree with her anyway because she was the one holding his hands and he was in no position to argue. He looked up at her and laughed. Not a smile, not a quiet sound. He laughed, an actual out-loud laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere below the throat, the kind that means something was genuinely funny and something in the person is genuinely alive and present enough to find it so. It was the first real laugh anyone at the Crooked Spur had heard from Hugh Bailey in longer than any of them could clearly remember. It was very early morning, and it so happened that Cord Pruitt had come to the kitchen for a glass of water because the bunkhouse water barrel was frozen, and he was standing in the doorway, and Frank Garza had come in behind him with the same purpose, and two other hands were close enough to hear. The laugh rolled through the kitchen and out the door and into the cold January pre-dawn, and the bunkhouse fell quiet. Cord stood absolutely still in the doorway. Frank stopped moving entirely. The laugh went on for a moment, and then settled, and Hugh looked around and saw the men in the doorway and then looked at Mamie, who was still holding his hands and looking at him with an expression that was extraordinary, wide open and warm and completely unguarded. Cord Pruitt, who was 21 and had a young man's gift for speaking what older men held back, said softly from the doorway, so softly it was almost to himself but was audible in the quiet kitchen, that it was the best sound he had heard since he could not remember when. Hugh looked at him. There was a moment, the particular moment that comes when something internal that has been locked finally turns over, and then Hugh said that Cord Pruitt should get himself some water and get back to bed because the morning was coming early. Cord got his water. Frank got his water. They went back to the bunkhouse and they told Pete and the others what had happened, and the bunkhouse was quiet again for a moment, and then Samuel Weeks said, "Well, I'll be." And that was the entire eulogy for 2 years of silence, which was about the right length for it. Mamie, in the kitchen, said nothing about what had happened. She went and got the coffee and poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from Hugh, and they drank their coffee in the middle of the night with the stove burning and the cold outside, and a warmth between them that had nothing to do with the stove at all. February in the morning, Mamie said something at breakfast that changed things for good. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that presents itself with nothing remarkable in its face. The hands were at the table in the various states of pre-dawn waking that working men achieve, some more present than others, coffee being the essential intermediary between unconsciousness and function. Mamie had made biscuits and gravy and fried eggs, and there was bacon, and the table was full of the sounds of men, engaged with breakfast in the serious way that hungry men engage with food. Hugh was at his usual place, which by February had shifted from the house to the bunkhouse table, not from any formal announcement but from the gradual daily migration of a man toward the people and the table he preferred, and no one had made any comment about it because it seemed right and natural and the way things should be. Mamie was pouring coffee around the table, and she reached Hugh's cup and poured, and then she stood there for a moment with the coffee pot, and she said, looking at Hugh, that she thought it was time they decided whether she was going to stay permanently. The bunkhouse fell absolutely quiet, not the working quiet of eating men, the complete quiet of 11 men who have stopped doing everything including breathing for a moment. Mamie looked at Hugh across the table, and Hugh looked at Mamie, and he said that he had been thinking about the exact same thing. She said that she had been at the Crooked Spur for 10 months, and that she knew what she wanted, and that she suspected he knew what he wanted, and that she thought one of them ought to say it plainly. He said that she was right that one of them ought to say it plainly, and that since she had started the conversation he thought she should finish it. She looked at him for a moment with the coffee pot still in her hand, and then she said that she would like very much to marry him, if he was of a similar mind, And she said it in the direct and unhesitating and deeply sincere way that she did most things, and it landed on the table like something solid and true. The bunkhouse was still completely quiet. Hugh said that he was very much of a similar mind and had been working up to asking her for approximately 6 weeks and was embarrassed that she had beaten him to it. She said there was no point in embarrassment. He said she was right about that, and he stood up and walked around the table to where she was standing with the coffee pot, and he took the coffee pot out of her hand and set it on the table, and he took her hands in his, and he said that he would like nothing better in the world than to marry her, and would she do him the honor? She said yes. Cord Pruitt, who had been sitting with his fork in midair since the moment the conversation began, put the fork down and started clapping, and the rest of the hands came in behind him. Frank Garza with his big slow nod that was the equivalent of a standing ovation from a steadier man. Pete Holly's whistling through his teeth. Samuel Weeks and Dahlan Reese slapping the table. And Cole Whitfield, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his gray eyes that looked exactly like his sister's, who said out loud and with genuine joy that it was about time. Hugh laughed again, the second time. This one without the surprise of the first but with even more warmth in it, and the kitchen was loud with the honest delight of men who have been working for something they wanted without knowing they were working for it. The wedding was on the first Saturday of March 1885, which gave them a month to prepare, and a month was, as Mamie pointed out, sufficient time if you did not get distracted by things that were not the wedding. Hugh rode to town and spoke to the pastor of the small Methodist church in Canyon Rojo, a patient man named Reverend Abbott who had been marrying and burying the people of the territory for 11 years, and who showed no surprise at the news, because little surprised him anymore. He booked the church for March 7th, and then rode to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Mamie's sister in Kansas, because that had been Mamie's first request, and the sister's reply came back in 2 days saying that she was coming, and she brought the baby, and she arrived on the Thursday before the wedding, a small determined woman named Clara with her husband Daniel and an 8-month-old boy named James who was round and alert and clearly intended to have opinions about everything. Clara Whitfield looked at Hugh Bailey with the full appraisal of a woman who loves her sister and intends to understand what kind of man she is marrying, and Hugh submitted to the appraisal without defensiveness, because it was entirely fair. After approximately 1 day of observation, she pronounced him solid, which was the highest compliment in her lexicon, and she threw herself into the wedding preparations with an energy that Mamie found both touching and exhausting. Cole Whitfield stood up with Hugh at the ceremony, which was Hugh's choice, and one that Cole was visibly proud of. Frank Garza polished his boots for the first time in what he admitted was probably 2 years. The entire bunkhouse crew turned up in their best clothes, which ranged from presentable to heroically attempted. The small church was full. Mamie came down the aisle in a dress that Clara had helped her make from good blue wool, and Hugh stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and felt the particular clarity that comes to a man when he is looking at the right thing, and knows it without any doubt whatsoever. Reverend Abbott performed the service with warmth and without unnecessary length, being a man who understood that the thing to be done was to get 2 people married, and that long sermons were not what the occasion required. They said their vows in the plain, honest way that the day called for, and Hugh put a plain gold band on Mamie's finger that had been his mother's, which he had kept in the drawer of his desk for 7 years without knowing why he was keeping it, and now he knew. After the ceremony, there was a celebration back at the Crooked Spur, because the ranch had the space and Mamie would not have it any other way, and Mamie and Clara cooked together in the kitchen for half a day, and produced a meal that had the hands of the Crooked Spur and several neighbors from the county eating for 2 hours, with the sustained joy of people being fed by people who love what they are doing. There was a fiddle player from town who played until 10 at night, and there was dancing in the yard in the cold March air, and Hugh danced with Mamie twice, which was twice more than he had danced at any occasion in at least 5 years. And she danced with him in the way of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for and intends to enjoy it. Clara and Daniel stayed for a week and then made the trip back to Kansas with baby James, and the ranch settled back into itself. But now it was a different self. It was a ranch with a married couple at the center of it, and this changed the shape of the place in ways that were partly practical and partly impossible to fully articulate. It was simply a home now in a way that it had not been before, and the men who lived and worked there felt the difference without being able to name it precisely. April and May of 1885 were the best months the Crooked Spur had had in years. The spring grass came in thick after a wet winter, and the herd was in excellent condition, and Hugh had made some careful purchases the previous fall that were paying off in the way that patient decisions pay off, and the books were in better shape than they had been since the year the North herd was stolen. Hugh hired 2 more hands, which brought the total crew to 13, and the ranch was operating at a scale that his father would have recognized as the right size for the land. Cole Whitfield was confirmed in a permanent position as a full hand, which he accepted with a handshake, and the particular quiet satisfaction of a young man who has found his footing. He was good at the work and good with the horses, and he was family, and the Crooked Spur was richer for his being there. The summer of 1885 was also when Hugh learned the full story of how the North herd had been stolen. He had known for years that it was the work of the Santa Fe outfit, a man named Driscoll who had since been convicted of other crimes and was currently serving time in the territorial prison, but the details of how it had been arranged, who had been paid and who had known, had never been fully clear to him. A federal deputy marshal named Tomas Reyes came through the territory that June following a connected case, and he stopped at the Crooked Spur and told Hugh what the investigation had turned up, which included confirmation that the man behind the original theft had been not Driscoll himself, but the man behind Driscoll, a business interest in Santa Fe that had since been broken up following the broader investigation. Hugh sat with this information for a day. He had spent 2 years in the shadow of that loss and then had spent another 2 years gradually emerging from it, and to hear the full shape of it now, with Mamie at his side and the ranch in good health and his own life in a state he could honestly describe as good, was a strange experience. The anger was there as it had always been, but it was smaller now. It did not have the same ability to fill the space. There were too many other things in the space now. He told Mamie about it that evening, and she listened, and said that justice being late was still justice, and that the important thing was what was standing now. He agreed that it was. She said that the Crooked Spur was a different ranch from the one that had lost the North herd, and that Hugh Bailey was a different man from the one who had ridden back in silence, and that different was not the same as lesser, and that she thought the version she knew was the better one, formed as he was by everything that had come before. He said that was a remarkable thing to say to a person. She said she meant it. He said he knew she did. They sat on the porch in the warm summer evening, and the cattle moved in the distance, and the last of the day's light went off the mesa to the west, and it was the kind of evening that makes a man feel that his life has arrived somewhere real. In October of 1885, Mamie told Hugh that she was expecting. He received the news in the kitchen on a morning when the leaves of the cottonwood by the creek were yellow, and the air had that particular autumn clarity that made everything sharp and bright, and she told him in her direct way, watching his face while she said it, and his face did something she had not seen it do before, which was to be entirely without its usual composure, entirely open, entirely undone in the best possible way. He put his coffee cup down and came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then held her for a long moment without saying anything, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and let herself be held, which for a woman of her independent nature was its own kind of statement. He said, when he could speak, that he was the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory. She said that she thought that was probably an exaggeration. He said it was not. She sent a letter to Clara in Kansas that afternoon. Clara's reply was the shortest letter she had ever written, which was one line saying, "Oh, my darling girl," followed by instructions about rest, and what to eat, and what not to eat that ran to 4 full pages. The winter of 1885 passed with the particular vigilance of a household waiting for something important to arrive. Mamie continued to run the kitchen with the same competence, though Hugh hired a girl from town, a 16-year-old named Beatrice who came 3 days a week to help with the heavier kitchen work, because Hugh had decided that certain things were not going to be done by a woman in her condition, regardless of what that woman said about being perfectly capable. And he said so with a firmness that Mamie found both exasperating and entirely dear. She told him he was managing her. He said he was looking after her, which was a different thing. She said from the perspective of the person being managed, it did not feel particularly different. He said that from the perspective of the person doing the looking after, it was the most important distinction in the world. She considered this, and decided it was accurate, and told Beatrice to take over the heavy pot lifting. Cole Whitfield, who had by now been at the Crooked Spur for over a year and was fully embedded in the life of the place, was going to be an uncle in the spring, and had the pleased look of a young man who is watching his family expand in a direction he approves of. He mended fences with extra care that winter and made sure the firewood was stacked correctly, and generally became even more useful, which Frank Garza noted approvingly. March of 1886 came in rough and went out gentle, and on the 17th day of the month, which was a Wednesday, Hugh Bailey and Mamie Bailey's son was born in the back bedroom of the main house at the Crooked Spur Ranch with the help of the local doctor, a steady man named Hargrove, who had delivered a great many children in the territory, and who declared both mother and child healthy and well without any unnecessary drama. Hugh was in the hallway outside the bedroom for approximately 4 hours, and then Dr. Hargrove opened the door and said he could come in, and he came in and found Mamie propped up in the bed with her hair loose and her face exhausted, and the most complete smile he had ever seen on it, and she was holding a small person wrapped in a blanket, a boy with dark hair, and a face that was red and new and absolutely unprecedented. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for a long time without speaking, and then he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, that he thought the boy had his mother's nose. Mamie said she thought so too, and that she was glad of it. He asked if she had thought of a name. She said she had a suggestion and that she wanted his opinion, which was that they call the boy William Robert Bailey, William for her father and Robert for Hugh's father, and that if he had strong feelings about any other name she was willing to hear them. He said William Robert Bailey was a fine name and a good name, and the boy should wear it well. She said she thought he would. Cole Whitfield came and held his nephew with the careful, enormous delicacy of a young man who has never held a baby and is terrified of breaking it. And baby William Bailey looked up at his uncle with the expression of someone who has not yet decided whether the world is satisfactory, but is willing to continue gathering data. Frank Garza stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said congratulations in the quiet, rumbling voice. And Cord Pruitt was so happy, he nearly fell over a water bucket in the yard and caught himself at the last possible moment. Spring moved into summer and summer into fall, and William Bailey grew at the rate that healthy babies grow, which is to say surprisingly fast, and the Crooked Spur moved with the seasons in the way that ranches move, marked by work and weather, and the slow accumulation of good years. The herd was growing back toward the size that Hugh had had before the theft, growing past it toward something better, and the ranch had the particular quality of a place that is moving in the right direction with the right people in it. Mamie at 30 ran the kitchen and the household with the same competence she had always had, with the addition now of a baby on her hip, and Cole's occasional help, and Beatrice coming 3 days a week as she had since the previous winter. She was not diminished by motherhood, she was enlarged by it, which was the way of women who carry their strengths into new things rather than surrendering them. She still made the best biscuits in the county, and she still had opinions, and she still spoke them directly, and the Crooked Spur ran as well as it ever had. Hugh at 35 was a different man from the one who had ridden home from the empty canyon in October 1882. Not a different man in his bones, not different in the way of having replaced himself with something easier or simpler, but different in the way of a man who has come back to himself after being away from himself for a long time. The laugh was there. It came when things were funny and sometimes when things were simply good, and the men who heard it still felt the warmth of it the way you feel warmth from a good fire. But it was no longer the startling thing it had been in January when it stopped the bunkhouse cold. It was ordinary now, which was the right way for it to be. Dexter Coles made one more attempt to acquire water rights along the Eastern Creek in the summer of 1886, and Hugh dealt with it the same way he had dealt with the first attempt, through the law and the county recorder's office and his lawyer in Santa Fe, and it was resolved in Hugh's favor more quickly this time. Partly because the precedent was already established, and partly because Coles had less political cover than he had previously enjoyed following a general change in the county board's composition. Coles eventually accepted that the Crooked Spur's water was not going to become his water and turned his attention elsewhere, and the matter was closed. By the end of 1886, two more things had happened that completed the picture of the Crooked Spur and the people on it. Cole Whitfield had fallen in love, which he had done with the same inevitability that everything in his family seemed to fall in love, which was without particularly intending to, but completely. The woman was named Ada Garza, who was Frank Garza's niece, a young woman of 20 who had come to visit her uncle for the summer, and had found the summer extending considerably when a certain lean young man with gray eyes kept finding reasons to be wherever she was. Frank Garza had opinions about his niece being courted by a ranch hand, but Frank Garza also knew Cole's character and his work and his family, and his opinions moderated into watchful approval over the course of several weeks, and by October he had given Cole the nod that meant he was not going to stand in the way. Cole came to Hugh and Mamie with the news and asked for the afternoon of Sunday to take Ada to town, and Hugh said of course. And Mamie looked at her brother and said that Ada Garza was a fine woman and she was glad of it, and Cole grinned in the way of young men who have been seen through by older sisters and do not entirely mind. They were married the following spring, in 1887, in the same church where Hugh and Mamie had married, by the same Reverend Abbot, and they set up in a small house at the edge of the Crooked Spur land that Hugh had helped Cole build through the fall, which put them close without being underfoot, which was the right arrangement for a growing family concern. The second thing was a second child, which Mamie announced in November 1886 with the same direct equanimity with which she announced most things, and Hugh received this news with more steadiness than the first, because the first time a man learns he is going to be a father is one kind of thing, and the second time is a different and also wonderful thing. And he held her and told her he was glad, and she said she was glad too, and they were both telling the truth. The second baby came in July 1887, and this time it was a girl, which Hugh had not fully prepared himself for, but adapted to immediately and completely, in the way that fathers adapt to daughters when the reality of them is placed in your arms and turns out to be the most beautiful thing you have encountered. They named her Clara Elizabeth Bailey, Clara for Mamie's sister, who sent the longest and most joyful letter she had ever written from Kansas, and Elizabeth for Hugh's grandmother, whose name he had always liked. Clara Bailey came into the world with her father's blue eyes and her mother's expression, which was to say she came in already taking inventory, already assessing the situation with a calm thoroughness that Mamie recognized immediately. Hugh held her and said that she was going to be trouble. Mamie said she hoped so. The Crooked Spur in the fall of 1887 was a different place from the one that had existed when Hugh Bailey first placed his advertisement for a cook in the Canyon Rojo Gazette 3.5 years before. It was bigger and better, and it was full of people in the way that good places become full when the right people are living in them. Baby William was 18 months old and walking with the aggressive confidence of a boy who has recently acquired the ability to move under his own power and intends to make full use of it. Baby Clara was 3 months old and observing everything. Cole and Ada were settled in their house at the edge of the property, and Ada was expecting in the spring. Frank Garza was still riding for the Crooked Spur and intended to do so for some years yet, and was the particular kind of contented that a man gets when the situation around him is ordered in a way he approves of. Cord Pruitt had stayed on and was now 24 and had recently been made the head night rider, which was a position of real responsibility, and he carried it seriously because he carried the memory of the night the North herd was stolen and had been building ever since toward being the kind of man who did not let that happen again. The night riding was flawless. Hugh and Mamie sat on the porch of the main house on an evening in October 1887, 5 years to the month from the night of the theft, and the land was the particular autumn color of the territory, the mesas red and the grass silver, and the sky going dark in the east with the stars beginning. William was asleep inside. Clara was asleep in the cradle they had moved to the kitchen for the warmth. The ranch was quiet in the good way, the way of a place settled into itself. Hugh said, looking at the land, that he had been thinking about the North herd. Mamie looked at him, not worried, just attentive. He said that he thought he had been carrying it for a long time as a wound, and that he was not sure it was a wound anymore. He said it was still something he would not have chosen, still a loss that had been real, but that he was no longer sure it was the most important thing that had happened to him. She asked what the most important thing was. He said it was her. It was the advertisement in the paper, and the letter that came back in clean, direct handwriting, and the woman who had arrived off the Santa Fe stage looking at the town of Canyon Rojo like she was taking inventory. He said it was all of it, everything since April 1884, all the mornings and evenings and walks and conversations, and the night in the kitchen with his cold hands and the laugh and the bunkhouse going quiet and the walk in the south pasture, and the wedding and William and Clara and all the rest of it. It was all the most important thing, and it had come to him on the other side of the worst year of his life, which meant the worst year of his life had led him here. And here was worth every bit of the getting to. She sat with that for a moment. The stars were coming up fully now, the enormous western sky filling with them the way it did on clear October nights. She said that she had been thinking that the Crooked Spur needed its name properly understood, and that she thought crooked was the right word for the way that life went, which was not straight but not broken either, just crooked the way a spur has to be curved to do its work. He laughed, the warm, real laugh that had startled a crow off the fence post in January and had been startling things ever since, and she leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the October night with the children asleep inside, and the herd settled in the south pasture, and the stars doing their ancient work above the mesas. The Crooked Spur went on. Seasons came and went over the red mesa country with their heat and cold and beauty and difficulty, and the Bailey family went on inside them. William grew into a boy who had his father's patience and his mother's eye for the way things worked, and he was at the fences and at the corral from the time he could safely be there, learning the work the way ranch children learn it, by watching and helping and gradually doing more until the day comes when you look up, and the boy is doing the man's work without anyone having declared the transition. Clara grew into a girl who had, as Hugh had predicted, a great deal of trouble in her, which was to say a great deal of intelligence and independence, and the particular quality of her mother's direct gaze applied to every question she encountered, and she was the delight of the Crooked Spur in a way that was specific and irreplaceable. Cole and Ada had their baby in the spring of 1888, a boy they named Henry, who was William's first proper playmate and companion, and the two of them together constituted a force of activity that kept their respective mothers in a perpetual state of productive management. Frank Garza finally retired from full ranch work in 1889, at 62, and Hugh built him a small addition to the bunkhouse that was properly his own, and Frank lived there and worked where he was useful and was fed at the Crooked Spur table for the rest of his long life, which was how it should be for a man who had given 30 years to the work. Cord Pruitt rose to foreman by 1890 and was the best foreman the Crooked Spur had ever had, partly because he was excellent at the work and partly because he had spent 8 years making up for a night that had never really been his fault. And by the time he understood that, he had built something real enough to stand on. Hugh Bailey was 40 years old in 1891, and he was a man who had arrived at 40 with more than he had started with, not just in the material sense, though the Crooked Spur was prospering, and the herd was larger than the North herd had ever been, and the land was in better condition than his father had left it. He was richer in the ways that matter more than land and cattle, in the way of a man who has been loved back to himself by someone who saw him clearly enough to know who he was and chose him anyway. Mamie was 34 and still made the best biscuits in the county, and still had opinions, and still told you what she thought in the clear, plain way that was one of the great blessings of her character. And she was the center of the Crooked Spur in the way that certain people become the center of things, not because they seek the position, but because they are genuinely indispensable, genuinely the person that every other person in the vicinity is a little bit better for being near. On a morning in November 1891, with the winter coming in cold and the kitchen full of the smell of coffee and biscuits, Hugh came in early, before the hands were up, which was his habit some mornings, and found Mamie already at the stove with her hair done up and the particular settled expression of a woman who is at home in the most complete sense of that word, who is in exactly the place she chose and finds it exactly as good as she chose it for being. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table and watched her for a moment with the feeling that had not diminished in 7 years of marriage, which was the feeling of genuine good fortune, the feeling of a man who knows exactly how close he came to having none of this. She turned from the stove and saw him watching and said what in the tone of a woman who is not alarmed but wants to know what the expression is about. He said he was just thinking. She said what about? He said about how good things had turned out. She set the biscuit pan down and came to the table and poured her own coffee and sat across from him, and she said that she thought things had turned out very well indeed, and that she intended for them to continue in that direction for a considerable time to come. He said that was exactly what he intended as well. She said good and drank her coffee, and the kitchen was warm and the morning was beginning, and outside the window the Crooked Spur sat under the enormous New Mexico sky, the herd grazing in the south pasture, and the red mesas standing in the distance, and the cottonwood by the creek yellow with November. And everything that had ever been lost in that land had been found again, and everything that had been silent had learned to speak, and the man who had not laughed out loud in years was laughing. And the woman who had not been sure she had found her place was in it, and the ranch that had been built from grief and stubbornness and love was going to stand for a long time, because it was built on all three, which is the most durable foundation there is.